So hello, everyone. My name is John Desjarlais. I am the Executive Director of the Indigenous Resource Network, and you're listening to another episode of the Indigenous Voices in Resource Development podcast. So on this episode, you'll get to hear from Jeff McCallum, who lives in Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, member of the Flying Dust First Nation, Treaty 6, and proudly part of our network. So Jeff has incredible experience in forestry and is the recruitment and retention specialist for Meadow Lake Tribal Council Industrial Investments. Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, John. Good to be here.
Awesome. So one of the first things, I think you've seen a little bit of this, of more of our own personal stuff, but before we jump into anything kind of professional and everything like that, we want to get to know the person a little bit more and start from that relational context. And so let's start with a little bit of your background. Tell us, where you're from, your kinship, your community, your extended community. Before we get into what you do, let's get to know the who before the what.
Okay, well, I've been born and raised in the area my entire life. My father is originally from Waterhen Lake First Nation, transferred to the Flying Dust First Nation after my parents got married. Cree and Métis heritage in our family. Been part of the community off and on for probably multiple roles on various boards like education, justice, governance. Part of a lot of Flying Dust community programming back when I was younger, and proud supporter of my community, whatever they're doing, whenever they're doing it. I'm currently married and enjoying my my hitched life and contributing.
The snag life. Yeah. The snag life. Yeah.
I'm loving every minute of it and still enjoying the work I do. I started with the Tribal Council after university as a communications coordinator, working on the governance file, which is the program built around getting our 9 First Nations at MLTCII sort of out from under the Indian Act so they could govern themselves as a sovereignty initiative. Very worthwhile program that's come and gone and taken different shapes. After about 10 years of that, I wanted a little bit of a change, so I moved from the administration side of MLTC to the corporate and business side, and ended up at North Sask Forest Products, which is their wholly owned sawmill operation just east of Meadow Lake.
That's incredible. Yeah, you spoke like there's a lot of interrelationships there where you've worked in community, you've worked in resource development, you've seen a lot of the sides, and you could probably speak quite well, and you do speak well to the impacts one has on the other and that relationship and everything. But you also spoke to kind of the intergenerational relationship with the industry. And so I think you mentioned you're a 7th generation worker in the past in the forestry industry. Is that correct?
I've had family members in and around the agriculture and ranching background in our region. I don't think we've traced our family quite that far back. As far back as great grandparents, they've always been people in the bush, people of the land.
I must be several generations, I think I've heard. So there we go. That's incredibly impressive. So tell us a little bit about the opportunities that working in industry has brought you, your family. Tell us about that, a little bit about that relationship.
Well, the industry sector in our region is pretty vast. Forestry is huge. Mining is big out here. We're moving into energy production as a tribal council. Always been some resource-based industry in our region. There always will be, because a lot of sustainable. MLTC is into solar in terms of being down in the southern part of the province where the exposure to daylight sunlight hours is the greatest. across the
Mm-hmm.
country.
Mm-hmm.
But specifically in my wheelhouse, there's always been family and friends and cousins and all manner
Mm-hmm.
of relations. All my relations have been involved in this industry around forestry, around the land, around, sustainable things. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
my community and my family, uh, they're on the lakes fishing, they're in the woods hunting. Some of them
Mm-hmm.
used to be in trapping. A lot of them were raising animals. A lot of them were helping out on farms.
Yeah.
It's a very
And,
land world.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's a land-based world. Those resources are there, and we need them as we develop them. And this is where I love hearing about how we develop those. How we're involved in all those different industries sustainably, right? And then asserting our values and things like that. I was really fascinated. There's so much in there. I just kind of love the story. You know, uh, your organization is involved in all energy forms and types, and through its investments in polar oils, I think it is, lubricants, through energy production, um, through solar, you mentioned, and I'm getting to tour the biomass energy center, like, and then the generation there in terms of how, the mill uses and creates product, and then uses its waste product to create energy, and then, and kind of that whole life cycle perspective. It's exciting to see, are people involved in the entire value chain, right? And then doing it with incredible capacity and everything like that. That's super, super awesome. I want to dive, a little bit more into, what does it take to get a person, I think, first involved in industry and in forestry, and then, what kind of training did you have? I think that helped facilitate your growth and your capacity development.
Well, if you want to know about our industry and what MLTC is doing, you kind of got to come and make that first visit. You got to have a little bit of outreach going on. That's part of my role now.
Mm-hmm.
Go out to the communities, go out to other regional events, career fairs, symposiums, and just make ourselves known, wave our flag a little bit and tell people like we're leading the way in, resource development, energy production, new and exciting little niche markets that we're exploring. We're always looking for our next big project. And while you're out there exploring, you meet people, you bring people in and you get them excited about what they're looking at,
Mm-hmm.
what's going on in their backyard. There's 9 First Nations out there that, need to be brought into that fold and explained,
Mm-hmm.
this is your company, this is what we're doing, and we want, your young and old people to know about it. Everyone should be proud of it. Everyone should have a part in, spreading the message of how big and how beautiful it is now, and it could only get bigger and more beautiful in the future.
Mm-hmm. We're storytellers, and we love telling stories, and we share information through storytelling. And I'm curious, what are some of your stories? What are some of your highlights in terms of working with industry? What are some of the stories that I think, that put smiles on all of our faces?
Well, the best part of what I do now is finding more of the young folk and telling them with as much reality and, you know and as much sincerity as I can. This is your
Mm-hmm.
company. This belongs to your community, and you have it here for the benefit of your current generation and 7 generations later. And then the students that come in,
Mm-hmm.
last year with all the tours we did, we had young people sit at our table and just see their faces light up, and they're like, I didn't know that my community was part of, MLTC's,
Mm-hmm.
sawmill, forestry, logging story successes. And they see the trucks moving in and out of their communities, and they have uncles and aunties and friends and siblings,
Mm-hmm.
working out in the bush and bringing logs to our location to be turned into lumber or
Mm-hmm.
biomass whatever it is, and just seeing them connect all those dots. There's a few young ladies and a few young men who were, by the end of the tour, asking like, how do I get involved? Like, can I ever have a job here? You know,
Mhm.
what what part of that exciting future can I play? Because it looks like a good place to work, and there's so many
Mhm.
people in the company that look like me and that I actually know. Like even
Mhm.
myself, I have family in the operation, about 5 or 6 people I'm related to just in our local ones
Mhm.
here. And
Mhm.
building those connections is probably the best part, the best story I can tell, because the young people are really excited about what could be and what already
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. It's incredibly exciting, and this is something we love to share. And then you spoke to it so eloquently. Is that we have a campaign. We say ownership matters, and then we spread that message and we say that. But through the work that we do here, this is where we really start to understand why it matters. And you spoke to that. Organizations, Indigenous ownership, Indigenous involvement throughout organization matters for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons you spoke to is that there's a sense of connection and pride that comes that as industry is telling us we're struggling with recruitment and retention of Indigenous people. We can't hit those rates. Yes, the population is 15%, but yet we're struggling to get 4 or 5% Indigenous people in our organizations. But yet Indigenous organizations are not having those same issues. We are pushing representation, of course, past those initial benchmarks into 40, 50, 60%, where we have incredible employability. And it's because we identify and relate with the people. We see representation. Representation matters. We see people that look like us, that come from same background socioeconomically, that are participating, that are included, that are heard and seen in ways I think that are much more meaningful to ourselves as Indigenous people. And we get excited. We want to work. We want to be part of that. At the we win. The desire to get up and do something, and that you spoke to it. It excites me because we do a lot of advocacy work, but it's working with people like you that really affirm why that's important, right? Why a lot of these things that you guys are doing is so important. So that's super cool, super awesome. That's good. That's what good looks like. That's one of the areas that good looks like. But I'd love to hear from you, generally, but we'll get into a few more specific questions. What does good look like to you in the resource industry?
John, what it comes down to for me is looking after people,
Mm-hmm.
um, especially in recruitment and retention. Part of my job is, well, the biggest part of my job is to bring Indigenous people in, the region's best workers into our system, let them try it out, let them see if they can establish themselves here, build
Mm-hmm.
their whole lives on a sustainable Indigenous owned industry and see how far they can take that. We've had so many lifelong career people in here, and it's only in the last decade or so where we've run into that same issue as every other industry, where there's
Mm-hmm.
turnover and there's turmoil, and not a lot of people are looking, past the bad instead of looking for that good you mentioned. And the
Yeah.
good is giving them a place and trying to help them feel supported and looked after. If they're
Mm-hmm.
having a bad day, a bad week, a bad stretch, you've lost people, you're suffering with a condition, your
Mm-hmm.
members are hurting. It takes minimal effort to just take that employee aside and say,
Mm-hmm.
it's rough now. We'll give you some breathing room up to a certain point so that you can get your house in order, look after the people you got to look after, because people bring work home and people bring home to work. And
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
in our culture, that's those two things are meshed together. It's
Mm-hmm.
just one life, your work and your home. There's no perfect line in between the two, and we can't
Yeah.
all pretend that there is. We have to look after the human. We have to look after the
Yeah.
that's in that person,
Yeah.
and
I,
that's what the good looks like to me, is looking after that person and giving them the space and the resources they need to make it here.
yeah, absolutely. Like, if I was to say what are some aspects, two things. If I was to say what are some aspects to economic reconciliation, one of them is that relationship of reciprocity, and so it's a relationship. It's where it's a balanced relationship, and I think in industry and business and commerce, I think we struggled in the past because we said you come and do something for us. That's it. That's the relationship. It's a transactional relationship. You do something, we pay you. That's that. But you spoke, wonderfully about about the strength of reciprocity, of how you look after us, we look after you. We understand you. You understand us, right? You understand what it takes for us to be a successful business, or we'll explain to you how your involvement with us is, contributes to us being a successful business. But at the same time, and you spoke to this, we understand you, and we understand your challenges. We understand truth and reconciliation. We understand a lot of those things and how they could impact you. And I'm a strong believer in seeing evidence of everywhere. Once you have that type of honest, open relationship and reciprocity, productivity comes, commitment and loyalty, all those things come. I think that we expect, just because we pay someone, that we expect people to give those, but it's not happening, and it's becoming a bigger issue in society today. But as we look after people, it doesn't cost us as a business to look after people. I think the ways that you discussed, and in fact, it contributes to a more successful business. But absolutely love that. That's what good looks like. Recruitment and retention, especially of Indigenous people, is to understand your people and to care for our people's whole selves, right? And our people will care for our businesses. They'll care for our business interests. They'll care for things that contribute to bottom line. So very, very well said. What about, we'll take it a little further. What does good look like in terms of Indigenous involvement in business development and procurement? You mentioned, seeing trucks and things like that, but what does good look like in terms of supporting not just the businesses that support us, but the communities as they try to grow? But yeah, what do you think good looks like from that perspective?
Well, from a systemic point of view, MLTC always tries to incorporate Indigenous businesses outside and inside of our realm. We want Indigenous contractors and their employees, no matter what their backgrounds are, no matter what anyone's real background is, if they want to be involved with Indigenous forestry and resource industries, we want them to be, fruitful and successful, because that only helps everyone else around them.
Mm-hmm.
The harvesting that takes place out there, the responsible forest management is looked after in an incredible way with all stakeholders at the table. There's no horrible, disastrous, unsustainable practices going on in our realm in terms of forestry, because those communities we have to answer to at the end of the day. Not only do we have to make some money so that they have some resources for programming at their community level, but we also have to make sure that their environment that we harvest from is always looked after. Those people have to be looked after. And coming back to my point previously, we're not 100% of the way there on looking after people. That's always an ongoing thing. We have a lot of people internally that don't come from that traditional mindset where it's to them it's still transactional.
Yeah.
We've got to build to a better environment internally, and part of that is just having a look in the mirror every once in a while and ensure that we're doing things in a good way, especially out in communities too, because the stories that our workers take home with them and spread out there at the end of the day are just as important as the ones we tell ourselves and tell other people. Our workers are ambassadors, and it's not always great news. Some people have bad days, and They get treated on the occasional, incident, but then
Yep.
the best of it, and they turn around and they're resilient and they're stronger, and they come back
Mm-hmm.
to work the next week or the next day in better shape.
Yeah. And that's an incredible lesson. I think, like, that's the reality. That's the true story. Like, we talk about business, we talk about Indigenous inclusion. It's not isolated to those challenges, right? It's not isolated to having all great days and perfect days and speaking these altruistic, sunshine and lollipops types of, there's real issues and real challenges. And yes, I think as we get through those less transactionals, accountability on the individual, but also with the organization, you can work through those. I think that's one of the things. I remember speaking to a fellow about partnership, and he said, we've had a successful partnership, and a lot of my peers, and this is a non-Indigenous business leader, he says we have a successful partnership, and where a lot of my peers, they don't have those successful partnerships. And he talked about, like, it's really tough. We work through those and everything. But what I got out of it and kind of reminded them is you never gave up. And that's what it's like with it's relational with Indigenous people, and you just don't give up your family, your kin. It's not a transaction. You work through those challenges, and you commit to the relationship, and you commit to the hard times. It truly is like a partnership, or like a marriage. And so you work through those, and I said that's what your peers have not been doing. They get struggled that the community doesn't see the business value, and they see the business value, and that should be it. No, it's much more than that. And so, but yeah, the other part to it is, that you mentioned, I think is really important. People should understand is, the business relationship. There's a priority to develop local businesses to provide that, but it's inclusive of every business locally, and that there's an accountability to communities. There's accountability to how we live sustainably, right? And so I think that's a really important lesson I think people should understand. And I think this leads into that good part. When you talk about engagement, and you might have spoke to this already, but we'll throw it out there anyway. In regards to consultation engagement, what does good look like when engaging with your Indigenous partners or communities? And you already mentioned, there's an accountability to community, include them and stuff. But yeah, just give you an opportunity to elaborate further. What does good look like? Consultation engagement.
Well, when we consult with the 9 communities, we go to the chiefs meetings, the leadership forums, and we're always given space at the one side of the room or the other to have our whole operations laid out on the table. We're there to answer questions. We're there so that you can take information back to their people when they're asked about it. So they're not just shooting from the hip and, to ramble on with half answers that haven't been updated in so long. That information is at their fingertips. It's there for all the leaders in all 9 communities. It's there for all the leaders in our regional governments, municipal, local, provincial, federal. It's that consultation and that networking that makes us who we are today. Out to the great examples we have right on our doorstep. Flying Dust First Nation is adjacent to the city of Meadow Lake. That marriage, like you put it, that has always served both places very well. There's a partnership there that has to exist. There's no way around it. Your neighbors, you have good neighbors who want to work with you on big projects that you couldn't do by yourself. And it's such a small city and a small community. Everyone knows everyone else. Everyone knows what's going on, and the only way forward is together. That's
yeah. Is it safe to say, like, something I'm really gathering out of here is there's an expectation on transparency. That's the one thing, and is it safe to say that? The other thing too is hearing, like, this doesn't sound like a process. This sounds like just a part of, like, not just a process or a project, consultation engagement doesn't sound like something you just get done. It sounds like it's embedded. It's a dynamic process. It's not something we just want to satisfy and move forward. So is it safe to say those two things? It's transparent and it's not just a simple process. An embedded dynamic part of how you do business.
Well, exactly, John. It's baked in. It has to be.
Yeah.
We we go home to the people who live next to the woods that we're
Hmm.
harvesting out of.
Hmm.
We have to make sure there's no mess at the end of the day. We have to make
Yeah.
sure that the employees that the community has sent to us have a place
Hmm.
to work in peace and safety. We have to make sure that accountability thing is
Hmm.
just integral. It's part of the
Yeah.
system and the infrastructure of what we do. Because if we don't have that trust, if we keep stepping on its toes or betraying it, we're never
Hmm.
going to get anywhere. We're just going to be putting out fires, so to speak, day,
Hmm.
day out about, well, you didn't say you were harvesting here. You didn't say you were selling lumber to this guy instead of this guy, or this group instead of this group. And it's
Hmm.
got to be fair at every level, not just a superficial one. And
Yeah.
that what makes it really good is that those cards are on the table and that information is at your fingertips when you need it.
Hmm. Yeah. That's incredible. And that's an important lesson I think people should understand. So we'll switch gears here a little bit. One of the reasons we stood up the network is, and we try to emphasize in all of our messaging that, it's been polarized and sensationalized that there's this romantic relationship that Indigenous people have with the land, and that we're against all development, right? Which is obviously, we're here conversing and talking about sustainable development, so we know that's not true. So that's important. We're against organizations that don't include Indigenous people, right? And so we're against that purpose, not so much the organizations, but that in purpose, meaningfully include Indigenous people in that process. And so the challenge is, usually some activist groups come from the outside of our community and they speak on behalf of our Indigenous communities. So, what would your response be to people, to organizations like that? If you could say something to those activists that come in and say, and then speak on behalf of Indigenous people, what would it be? We have issues with prominent, media and social media and Hollywood stars that do this, right? And so if you were to say something to those people, so that they consider your voice in terms of responsible development, what would you say to them?
Well, the first thing I would say is that there's a balancing act, and there always has been. If you want
Mm-hmm.
to make the best use of the natural resources out there, no matter what they are, you have to
Mm-hmm.
go after those same resources. Like, you can't harvest from the same place that you hate. You first of all, you have to love it. You have to know that
Mm-hmm.
connected to that.
Mm-hmm.
The balancing act comes in when you bring in the economics and the financial and the
Mm-hmm.
development and industrial side of things. You
Yeah.
can't just scorch the earth. That was never an option for us at
Mm-hmm.
MLTC. And we've had communities in the past that stood up and asked for better practices and more environmentally friendly policies and procedures. And
Mm-hmm.
there was never an option to not listen to that. Those are your people. Those
Mm-hmm.
are communities that you're trying to support and build up
Yeah.
and strengthen. You can't
Yeah.
ever step on their toes or spit in their face, and they can honestly smell the bullshit 3 miles away. You
Yeah.
have to always answer to those people. And as MLTC is proven, like currently and in the past, they've opened their ears to those things. So
Mm-hmm.
don't end up in positions where we have, endangered species, falling in population across our lands. We don't have lakes and rivers. We don't have, toxic dump sites and horrible wastelands in our backyards. But
Mm-hmm.
from the outside who need to know and need confirmation that those things aren't happening, they just have
Mm-hmm.
to go and see it with their own eyes. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying those things don't exist. We live in a
Mm-hmm.
whole global, industry harvesting.
Yeah. With legacy issues, absolutely.
Yeah, there's always going to be the companies that don't have those same values that
Yeah.
will take the fastest way to the buck, and they will deplete and
Mhm.
leave a mess behind. And it's sad. And those are the environmental horror stories that a lot of the
Mhm.
activists see. And it's hard not to paint everyone with that same brush.
Yeah. 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 And
They really need to have a good, hard, deep dive look at
Mhm.
companies that are doing the right things, where they
Mhm.
improve, and then, of course, if you have to, shine a bright light on the ones that aren't doing it right, and we'll see where we go.
Mhm. Yeah, no, there's so many things that are important that I think people need to understand. But one of the I think larger themes is that if you have indigenous led or meaningfully engaged development, there's a responsibility to the land in which we're engaged on, and I think people should hear that. Organizations should hear that. And it's important to elevate the voice of indigenous participation because it moves development along, as you eloquently said. In line with that, one of the things we talk about, you talk about sustainably, you talk about a lot of ways in which we as Indigenous people assert who we are in terms of how we do business, how we engage in resource development. So, how would you say that you deliver on your values as an Indigenous person working in resource development and industry?
Well, it starts when you're meeting new people, when you're trying to get someone in the door to come work for you. I
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to make up a whole lot of, you know, spin. I don't have to make up a whole lot of, enticing stories. I'm selling what we're selling at face value,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what
Mm-hmm.
it is at its core. This is a job in industry, in a noisy, busy, industrial facility. And it's the same for any other MLTC company. Like, you have to bring in the people who want to be part of that specific industry at that specific time.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't have to window dress that. You should just be able to have,
Mm-hmm.
like I said, all cards on the table. And that's where I connect on a human level with applicants.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I shake their hand, I smile. If they say something to me in Cree or Dene, I at least know the greetings enough to know that I've been said hello and goodbye to.
Yeah.
I I have pictures of our people or our facilities on the table in front of them so they can see. The community logos are on the back of our printed products. Their home communities are right there in front of them so they can
Mm-hmm.
see. That's my reserve right there.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
right at face value, right off the cuff. They know I'm
Yeah.
I'm pulling for that community and the other eight.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that's important when you're trying to do like a face to face and connect on that first level. And
Yeah.
it's so important when you're trying to get them into the industry, because a lot of them just don't know about it. They haven't
Mm-hmm.
learning enough about it, and that's where I come in.
Yeah, no, that's great. There's a real kinship there. I think that's, and an accountability to it. I think that really comes up. And like you mentioned, it transactional. No, this is relational. There's a kinship character there. I think that's really incredible. We'll step a little bit out of what we talked about, and then maybe a little less you specifically, a little less MLTCII and or SAS specifically. Let's talk about the industry in general. So oftentimes, in terms of marketing and industry and stuff like that, and this is where important, like, we want to tell a real story, not the ideal story. And so, there's this romantic relationship when it comes to Indigenous relations. Um, you know, I'm sure that there have been difficulties in the past. What are some of your experience in terms of Indigenous relationships and some of those difficulties in the past?
Well, the things that come to mind are from just in my lifetime. There have been roadblocks. There have been people who had to stand up to the logging companies that were
Mm-hmm.
here long before our own were.
Mm-hmm.
There's some very shady, harvesting practices taking place in our
Mm-hmm.
region at one point, and you don't want to shine the lights on those all the times. You don't want to tell the bad stories, but you still have to learn and grow from, those
Yeah,
past,
from them.
they're not our experiences per se, but they are
Mm-hmm.
the greater community's experiences. And
Mm-hmm.
the only way around that is, you have to look at the industry for its history, for what it is.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can't, you can't pretend it's something else. It used to
Mm-hmm.
be almost like a filthy and greedy kind of
Mm-hmm.
resource extraction industry at one time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
before all the regulation got built in, before everyone sort of got on board with looking after the forests, it was
Mm-hmm.
a company for itself. And you have that history that you're sort of working away from. That's what
Mm-hmm.
you saw what not to do from
Yeah.
some of the stories, from some of those places where trucks and equipment had to be parked across a logging road.
Yeah. No, and that's an important lesson that we need to, and an important history lesson that we must never repeat. And it might still exist, and likely probably does. And an important lesson and warning to organizations, if you extract resources without that type of without either leadership from Indigenous community involved, ownership or participation, that you're going to have serious issues and challenges. And so, I think, industry needs to take heed to that. And, there's certainly more assertion from communities that, we're no longer going to, take all the environmental risk and then, not participate and we want to participate in these industries in meaningful ways. And I think, it's important lessons I think people need to understand. So, I'm sure everything's not perfect. And let's speak to industry in general here. What changes or improvement would you like to see in forestry to further support Indigenous participation and benefit from, the development of those resources?
In my dream world, I see a future for forestry, for resource industries in our region, where we're more on the same page than we have been on the past. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Regulators, environmentalists,
Mm-hmm.
responsible harvesters all need to know what good looks like, what sustainable looks like. And to your point, it's not always the same thing. It hasn't always ever been exactly the same thing. There have been
Mm-hmm.
companies that wanted to do more, cut a little extra, dirty a little bit of lake or river to get to where they're going,
Mm-hmm.
put in some intrusive, destructive roads to get to their cut blocks. And there's got to be that balance there where the outside world keeps us honest. The people in those communities come in and, blow the whistle and cry foul and be like, you can't
Mm-hmm.
log here. There are
Mm-hmm.
fish to worry about. There's deer to worry
Mm-hmm.
about. There's
Yeah.
plant medicines and cabins and land users that can't be
Mm-hmm.
infringed upon here. And we need them to come in and sort of stand on that road and, wave their flag
Mm-hmm.
and be like, you can't do that here to that extent. Yes, you have to make money. Yes, we like that you put resource money into our program dollar, accounts, but there's always that but. You can't
Mm-hmm.
do it to the extent where you're causing irreparable harm or you're hurting people or you're working your own people too hard. You're pushing
Mm-hmm.
companies too hard to do too much in too short a time. Play the long
Mm-hmm.
game. That's
Yeah.
what it comes down to.
Yeah.
Get everyone on the same page eventually, playing that long game where, like we do now, where you cut and then 100 years later you can cut again.
Yeah.
Keep that window wide open and protect its borders. Otherwise, you're running the risk of causing damage that you can't undo.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's incredible. Like, and that's the lesson, not just to our Indigenous communities, but also to industry. The allure of fast cash, right? Play the long game. Sustainability in terms of our environment is also related to sustainability in terms of our business and business development and growth, right? And so, Be prepared to play the long game. That's where growth comes from. That's where we can serve those sustainable practices in the best way possible. I think that's an important lesson I think people need to understand. That's awesome. One of the things I hear about, and maybe you can help me understand a little bit more. So we've done, like, we advocate and say, we've done advocacy in terms of our position, and more needs to be done to fight climate change in terms of sustainable practices. Forest fires, protecting jobs in the forestry industry, things like that. But one of the solutions we keep hearing about is prescribed burning. And it's seen as an important part for the ecosystem, but we also hear very culturally significant. Could you speak to some of those impacts prescribed burning could have on mitigating forest fires? Do you have much experience with that?
I don't have any extensive experience with that, but I've done a little bit of the research, especially in modern wildfire seasons where it's been such a huge front and center issue. We've had summers in our region where it's brown and orange sky for days and weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Our communities, our own 9 communities, have been severely affected, evacuation level affected.
Mm-hmm.
All the northern wildfires. And what I've learned in that time is that there is sections of the forest that were already flagged, were already looked at, were already, targeted for, just a massive cleanup burn effort. Traditionally, we always had wildfire knowledge keepers who knew what parts of the woods needed to be, managed, stewarded. You had to get the whole big picture because wildfire has always been around. It's never not been an issue, especially now with so much of our moisture sort of being in that dry end of the 5 or 10 year cycle. It's so dangerous in the north with so many, I guess, unbordered forests open to the threat of wildfire, and so many communities nestled perfectly in the center of those regions where the wildfire management plans could have reduced or mitigated some of the risk. That traditional knowledge has to come back into play and be listened to. It can't just be outside governments coming in and calling all the shots. They have to listen to the locals about what side of the lake or the community that fire is going to come to, depending on the winds and the airflow from east to or west to east. You got to follow the airstreams. You got to follow the physics, and you got to listen to the people who knew all about that for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's incredibly important. There's a wealth of knowledge there that is held by Indigenous communities to help mitigate a lot of these challenges, right? And so I think that's very important to hear. So one of the last things I think, before we wrap up, get to your opinion, and we'll speak to this more generally. So do you think that the forestry industry, forestry per se, generally is achieving success and reconciliation as we understand it?
I feel like what forestry in a broader sense is doing is showing the world that there are resource extraction industries that can be managed perpetually. You can keep regrowing trees, and our partners and other organizations are doing that important work. You're making sure there's going to be trees to harvest for all of time, for as long as the land can support those trees. We want to be planting them and growing them, and then later harvesting them and making those resources, and then replenishing the land, and then doing it all over again. That's an important cycle that we need to sort of bring attention to. You have to do if you want to achieve something that is always going to be there. That's a part of reconciliation. That is investing in a system that can keep itself afloat for all of time without having
Mhm.
that depletion and clear cutting mindset that has gotten us into trouble and has
Mhm.
really harmed a lot of communities.
Yeah.
There's a lot of harm in the past done, and part of rebuilding the self-sufficiency of not just our 9 First Nations around MLTC, but all localized villages, towns, and cities. If we don't
Mhm.
together and look after our resources and our land, well, then what do we have? We're all in the same storm in different boats,
Mhm.
trying to get through, uh, you know, a land we can't even use anymore because we're
Mhm.
Indigenous people aren't the only users of the land. Everyone,
Absolutely. Yeah.
everyone lives here. Everyone
Yeah.
has to grow here. Everyone has to be safe and breathe the air. Everyone
Yeah.
has to have a lake to go and play in, rivers to fish
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. And that's yeah, beautifully said. We all should have that type of relationship with the land that takes care of us. We take, we should give, and we should, and if we're to say industry is achieving success and reconciliation, we can say it is if it's certainly taking the view that it's the long game. We do things sustainably, we engage sustainably, we balance the economics with the long-term health and growth and prosperity of the resources and the land in which we take from. That we understand that relationship, and then that communities are certainly engaged and receiving the benefit that we should be, right? That I think that is equitable and just. So wonderful way to wrap, I think, our conversation up. So, Nanaskawan Nichagan, thank you very much, my friend. Been an absolute pleasure talking with you. But do you have any last minute, words, I think, for our listeners in terms of anything you want to say before we sign off?
Sure, John. To me, reconciliation means bringing everyone into the same circle and having a look at each other's lives. A lot of Canadians have not done the homework, have not done the long-term, long game planning about
Mhm.
whose, you know, whose world Canada is, whose lands they're, all sharing and enjoying. And it's bringing everyone into that circle and having a good hard look, not just at the past, because there's so much trauma and triggering things back there, but also looking at the present and where we are now. And
Mhm.
once you have that good long stare in the mirror, not just at yourself, but at your neighbor and your fellow land users, the people who share your country, it
Mhm.
comes down to a human level. And that's the only way we get over all those divisions. That's the only way we get to reconciliation, is to
Mhm.
ignore those lines and fade them into the background and take a look at the person who you used to be so politically charged against and say, well, that's still a human being. That's still someone who needs to share this land with me. And we'll all make space for each other as long as we're all on the same page about looking after it.
Yeah. Beautifully said.
Yeah, that's the message I would leave on.
Yeah, I love it. Beautifully said. Important. There's no hierarchy. It's a circle. We look at each other. And that requires, in order for us to look out and to be in the present and to acknowledge the past, we also need to be looking within that mirror, right? And so cultural humility is so important. No, I think those are beautiful words to kind of wrap up today on. So thank you for spending the morning with us. Thank you for sharing. I think so many important lessons. I think people need to really not just hear, but listen to, and to embed in terms of how they do things, and people to start to understand, how Indigenous business adds value to the larger economy, to the larger business economy, and I think you've spoken it quite well. So thank you very much, Jeff. Appreciate it very much.